I teach a number of classes at Eastern Washington University. My niche is something called compassion-focused therapy, which is a therapy model that meshes pretty well with Buddhist practice perspectives and things like this. But we were doing a couple of days on mindfulness maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, and we decided, I thought, well, we should go outside. It was a beautiful day, and so we went outside and kind of wandered across campus for a little while and found a nice shady spot, right? And it was just the big majestic trees, and the grass was nice and cool and dry. And I thought, this is perfect, right? It's great. So we all kind of hunkered down and got ready to do a really soothing mindfulness practice. And then the lawn mowing people pulled in, right? The big noisy industrial lawn mower. And it was perfect, because I think it was such a beautiful capturing of how things go, and how if we get hooked into this idea of striving to get things just right, and I don't know if you ever fall into that, but I do that sometimes. It's like, okay, I've got all these different things going on in my life, kind of moving around in different ways, and if I only get all of that kind of dialed in, then everything will be cool for a while. I can just take it easy and kind of relax. And like the moment you get there, right? Have you had those, like the moment where everything seems like it's nailed down and is going all right, then the dishwasher doesn't drain, or something. And it's just the way it is, right? It's sort of the nature of it. Impermanence and the way reality just sort of shifts around us and within us. And I think there's a real lesson there. Like maybe not so get so attached to the way things ought to be, or this desire to give everything sorted in a particular way. But it was really interesting. And actually in the student reflections after, they commented on how, once they settled into the practice, the lawnmowers didn't bother them at all. It just became something else that was happening to sort of be kind of curiously aware of. So welcome. I was wondering if we could do like a round of introductions real quickly, so I could get to sort of know you. If you could tell me sort of who you are and where you're from, and maybe how you came to be here on this particular week. My name's Russell, and I've been doing this for quite some time, and I know Venerable Chodron and many of the monastics here, and it's been a great pleasure in my life over the last couple decades to watch Sravasti Abbey grow from basically that building to what's almost, you could almost call it a campus at this point, right? It's a really, and it is a special place, not just to have a Buddhist sort of center of this magnitude here, but to have it led by a woman, which in the world of Tibetan Buddhism is a sort of a cool thing, and not necessarily a common thing. So I'm always excited to come back. My only regret around the Abbey is I don't make it up here nearly as often as I'd like and benefit from. So if we could go around with introductions, that'd be great. Do you want to go? Well, I'm glad you all found your way here, and I hope it's been, I trust that it's been a positive experience so far, and I have no doubt that it will continue to be. I do know also that it can be disconcerting, I think, in some ways, if you're used to the sort of hustle and bustle of the world outside a monastic setting. I'm a psychologist, so you'll forgive me if I get a little geeky now and again. But our brains are basically adaptation machines, right? So they learn to adapt to whatever they're exposed to over time. And of course, the more of that they get, the more they get specifically adapted to those things. And I don't have my phone with me because it's in my car, for good reasons, right, here at the Abbey. But if I did have it, I'd hold it up as a prop and say, unfortunately, these devices we have, and lots of other things in our worlds, have, for many of us, trained our brains to need kind of constant, or expect constant stimulation. Right? We're just being bombarded by stimulation all the time. And has anyone struggled a little bit to adapt to a world where this stimulation's a little less constant? Yeah, I remember even, I'd done a lot of meditating, but I remember the first time I did a retreat here, and I've only done a couple, I haven't done too many. It was like 4 or 5 days maybe. And by like day 2, I was going stir crazy because my brain was like, where's all the stuff? I'd go back to my room in the evening and it's like, and I went to check the phones in the car. I'm not checking the phone. It takes a while, and it can feel tricky, when that happens. And, something else that happens, and I don't know how many like experienced meditators there are in this group or not, but another thing that happens, particularly if one has a history of trauma or different kinds of emotional hurts or things like that, when we begin to quiet the mind and not filling it with endless chatter, a lot of times the stuff that we've kind of been maybe unconsciously holding at bay or kind of not open to because it's really uncomfortable kind of begins seeping in. And it can do that in really weird, unpredictable ways too. Right? It's never quite how you expect it. And it can be really scary too because the way that plays out can be very embodied, right? Depending on your history, and that can be. And so, I don't know the extent to which you've had those sorts of experiences here this week, but I wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily expect them, but I would not expect them either, right? Because when we quiet the mind, these other things like show up. And I think with that in mind, the extent we can maintain kind of a stance of curiosity around that stuff. I'm sort of the notion that kind curiosity is kind of a superpower. Right? That ability to just kind of, oh, wow. Whew, look at that. That feels strange and not necessarily in a comfortable way. Right? And just sort of notice, notice that. I saw a meme a while back, and it was an instruction like a first grade teacher gave their class. And I thought, boy, I wish I'd gone to that elementary school. They were talking about the mind's kind of like a pond with a lot of fish swimming through it. Be the pond, not the fish. Let's try. So I like that. So anyway, I guess this is not what I came to talk about, but with the awareness of sort of what you might be experiencing this week, I just urge you to hold whatever arises within you with some kind of curiosity, and just notice that it all makes all the sense in the world that you'd have these experiences, that your brains and your minds work this way, and just to try and hold it all in curiosity and kindness, like, oh yeah, this is what it's like for me. And if you notice that there's a version of you that's like struggling, that's really kind of having a hard time, maybe see if it's possible to connect with a compassionate version of you and ask, well, what does that version of me need? What would help that version of me feel safe as this stuff sort of begins to show up? So I talk a lot about compassion because that's kind of my area. When I say the word compassion, what comes to mind for you? There's not like a right or wrong answer. Go ahead.
For me, when I think the word compassion, it means holding kind of constant empathy for a single person, and then over time that can grow to a multitude of people.
Yeah.
And usually, kind of to get to that kind of compassion, you need to work with one person and constantly hold empathy and caring for them, and then that will, over time, you can have more people too.
So your compassion. Tell me when you say empathy. I'm a psychologist, so we get real hung up on terms.
I guess empathy as in keeping constant desire for them, for their suffering to end.
Yeah.
And holding that consistently. I took a class, or I guess I still am taking a class on compassion at my temple at home. That was the best definition you gave. Someone brought up empathy. And the teacher's like, I don't know what empathy is, but I know what compassion is.
Empathy, and I'm not speaking from, actually, that's an interesting question. I don't know if Buddhists talk about empathy too much. Psychologists talk about empathy at all, or a lot. When we say empathy, we mean like understanding the emotional experience of whatever being you're being empathic toward. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so, Phelan, you got, Phelan.
Yeah.
Phelan, you got the compassion piece, right? It's about like being sensitive to the suffering, right? Sensitive to suffering combined with a motivation to try and alleviate it or prevent it, right? So it's this combination of noticing, being aware of suffering, and then getting really curious about what would help, what would be helpful. That's really how I think of it. So very nice. I will caution you just a little bit, Phelan, in terms of, I'd encourage you not to try and place too many rules around how it has to work when you're developing compassion. So I think, for example, as you say, quite often it begins by having compassion for somebody else, right? Having someone we really care about and having compassion. And then once we kind of figure that out, we can extend it out. But I think sometimes it can arise in other ways. Like sometimes maybe our first really powerful experience of compassion isn't compassion we feel, it's compassion someone else shows us, right? And then we go, oh, wow, that was really powerful. That was really helpful. I want to be more like that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think it's really tempting, and I think our education system sort of pounds this in for good reason, because for a lot of situations there are correct answers, right? There are more and less correct ways of talking about things, but I think that we shape ourselves to think, oh, it must be this way, and I think the extent to which we can kind of loosen up on that and get really curious about noticing how does it work for me, what's helpful, what's not, I think makes it more likely we'll be able to access these sorts of experiences. So does that fit with other people's experiences of compassion? The idea of it's being I like the idea of being moved by suffering, because it implies sort of an emotional experiencing on the part of the person who's feeling compassion, but sort of sensitivity to suffering combined with a motivation to alleviate it and prevent it. And if you look at the evolutionary psychologists and this holiness both sort of talk about really the evolution of compassion as being rooted in our need to care for our young, right? When mammals sort of emerged into the flow of life, they were in sort of a unique situation. Prior to that, if you look at reptiles and amphibians and things like this, they just lay hundreds of eggs. Right, and so if a predator eats 97 of them, there's still enough of them to keep the species going. Mammals have very few young, and we're helpless, right? If you survive to this point, I can assume nothing about your history except during that first couple of years you had somebody who did something to keep you alive, right? Because if you didn't, you wouldn't be here. And so we actually, as a species, had to develop this capacity to nurture, to be able to notice need and to respond to it in a helpful way, because we wouldn't have survived otherwise. In compassion-focused therapy, I think historically, and actually when I got into CFT, which was our pithy abbreviation for compassion-focused therapy, I had always thought about compassion in terms of the compassion we feel for other beings, right? That's what compassion is. And one of the things that psychology has done over the last 20 years is we've discovered that actually if you look at a lot of the major mental health problems that human beings tend to find themselves in, and particularly those that are sort of resistant to other treatment approaches, other therapy approaches. There are some people, for example, that, even in the 90s, they would use these basically cognitive behavioral treatments to try and help. And these are treatments that worked pretty well for a lot of people, but there were groups of people who it wasn't helpful for, it didn't work. And when you talk to those people, what you often found was that they held a lot of deep-seated shame and self-attacking and self-hatred. Right? And it was experienced not like at the level of what in psychology we call automatic thoughts, right? Thoughts that are firing off in our minds all the time. I mean, when you talk to people with this sort of shame conviction, it was felt like way down, like something you know. You know what I mean when I say that? Like there are things we think, but there are other things that's like, oh, I know this. And I know this to be true. And for a lot of people who struggle, underneath everything else is this felt sense of knowing there's something wrong with me. There's something bad about me. There's something flawed or broken or not okay. And I think that thought, there's something wrong with me, is one of the most painful sort of human psychological experiences that we can have. I also think it's quite common. I think it's quite common. I think it's common for lots of different reasons. I think many of us, I think we in the West, particularly in the States, I think the West may be a little better at this, but I don't know. We're really good at, our economy, I'm not getting like too political here, but our economy is really based on selling people a lot of things they don't need, right? Because that's kind of how it works. If people only bought the essentials, right? If they only purchased the food and the shelter and, that kind of stuff, the economy would be pretty flat. A lot of it is based on sort of selling people things they don't need. So how do you sell people things they don't need? Well, I'll tell you how you don't do it, right? What doesn't work very well, in my estimation, is to tell them, you already have everything you need. Right? Everything you need for a meaningful life, for a fulfilling life. I won't say a happy life, because I think happiness is actually not a great life goal globally. I think it sets us up to think we ought to be happy all the time. And actually life involves a lot of discomfort and things like this. Right? But to have a life that's sustaining and meaningful and, has some depth and some happy moments, there's only so much stuff we need, but you don't sell people things they don't need by reminding them of that. It works much better, actually, if you create an understanding that says something like, you really should be happy all the time. And if you're not, that means there's something wrong. But don't worry, because if you buy this cool cup for only $5.99 plus tax, you'll have the life you always wanted. Right? How many times have you seen a version of that story? This is a very nice cup, by the way. It's very nice. I like the lid. So I think there are these cultural messages, right, that sort of circulate that say you should really just sort of be happy all the time, or you should, social media, right? Any of you spend any time on social media? Yeah, hopefully not too much. I just mostly post pictures of trees and things now. And I fill my feeds with people who also post pictures of trees, and it's nice. But, I think we also evolved to be sort of intimately concerned with how we exist in the minds of others, right? We want other people to think of us as competent and intelligent and attractive and desirable to be around and all of those things, right? We want those things. And it makes sense, too, because, back for much of human history, right, we didn't live in these massive societies where, like, if I managed to tick off everybody in Spokane, right, which if you knew me, you'd know it's possible, right? But imagine I do. Imagine I managed to tick off everyone in Spokane, it would be inconvenient, but I could just up and move to Seattle, right? And it would be fine. I'd find my own niche there. It'd be great. That's not the way it used to be, right? We used to live in these sort of small, isolated kind of groupings. And, if you got kicked, the other people out there were competing tribes who competed for the same resources. So if you got kicked out of your group, that was a death sentence. right? This highly interdependent group. That's also very likely why, if we look at the basis of sort of prejudice and bigotry, so much of that is anchored to physical appearance cues, right? Because if you're out in the wilderness and you see another person over there, you need to very quickly figure out, is that one of my people or is that not one of my people? Because if it's not one of my people, they're probably going to kill me because we're competing for the same resources. Does that make sense? And the problem is that sort of evolutionary heritage, I'm going to come back to the main point in a second, but I want to highlight this because it underlies, I think, a lot of the challenges we face. Has anyone heard of oxytocin? Oxytocin is a chemical. What does oxytocin do? When you hear it, what do you think about? Yeah, so when you get a rush of oxytocin, you feel connected, right? Nursing moms, they initially studied in nursing moms, and when moms are nursing their babies, there's just oxytocin flooding through the mind of the mom and the baby, facilitating connection. And you're right, we see that in other contexts too. But the research on oxytocin is actually very interesting. For a while, they sort of thought that if we just gave everybody oxytocin gum in the morning, that would solve everything. We just all love everybody. And it's actually true. You see some quirky things. So, for example, you find like a rom-com, right? What they used to call like a chick flick. And you get groups of men and women together and have them watch the romantic comedy. What you might predict, right, about the emotional expression of the people is that the women would become tearful and emotional watching this romantic comedy and the men wouldn't, which was true initially. But if you gave the men oxytocin gum, they were as weepy as the ladies. Right? By the way, in my relationship, it's the reverse of that. I'm the one going, oh my gosh. But so you thought, well, we just give all these Henri men oxytocin gum and we'll all kumbaya and get along. It'll be great, right? Well, it turns out it doesn't quite work that way. When you get a rush of oxytocin in your brain, when we get a rush of oxytocin, we feel more connected, but we only feel more connected to our people. In fact, if there's an identified out group, if there's a they or a them sort of in our universe, when oxytocin is released, not only do I feel closer to my people, but I feel more suspicious of those people. Right? Because think, it evolved to help me connect with my tribe and protect. And so this is very tricky. Think about that. Think about what that means for humanity. That even the chemicals, even the stuff that happens in our brain that helps us feel connected to one another can drive division between us. Right? If there's an out group, if there's a they, if there's a them. And I think that's one of the things about Buddhism that is so beautiful. Because I think Buddhism, I can't speak, I don't know actually. I haven't read a lot of Buddhist teachings on diversity, but my experience of Buddhism is that it works in such a way that it honors the differences of the different traditions and places that people come from and the different histories that we have, which is an important part, right, of working around lots of humans and diversity, right? The States has discovered to our detriment that when you just ask everybody to just all act like they're the same, can we all just pretend to be white people? Right? Yeah. It doesn't work very well, right? We have to honor the differences and the uniquenesses that come together, while at the same time recognizing that there's an us that's bigger than those differences. And if we can do that, if we can relate to one another in a way that doesn't pretend there aren't differences, but includes them and transcends them maybe in terms of our understanding of the nature of reality and what it means even to have a human life, then we can include everybody in the us and get our oxytocin working for us. Does that make sense? But as long as there's an outgroup, as long as there's a them, as long as there's a those people, not who are separate from my people, even the things, the way our brains work, that connect us, that help us feel connected, can drive division. Isn't that tricky? So, for that reason and lots of other. Oh, by the way, and it gets worse in terms of tricky bits around self-judgment and self-attacking and shame. Part of it is also, I think, linked to our perception and the way our emotions work. So just think about it for a moment. We talked about how we're very concerned about how we exist in the minds of others, right? We want others to see us in all these sort of positive ways, and so we sort of put on our game faces. You know what I'm talking about? Like in the morning, a lot of people, millions of people this morning, literally got up and painted on their game faces, right? Because we live in a culture that particularly tells women they need to do that. So we go out into the world presenting the best versions of us, taking selfies and putting them on social media. Look at me and how together I have it. And that's very tricky, because if you think about how human perception works, like we have almost unlimited access to our own internal experiences. Right? Think about it. If you're anxious, or if someone's done something unfair that was hurtful to you and you're angry, or you're worried about something that is going to happen or could happen. We've got another presidential election coming up in 2 years. I mean, already, you're seeing the swirlings around these different things. And if I'm feeling all that stuff, I can swim in that like all day long. Have you ever had that experience where you're just struggling? You just feel like you just barely got it together, or maybe you don't, right? So I'm acutely aware of all of the stuff that I've got going on inside me. But when I look out at you, and I mean this in all sincerity, you folks look like you've got it together. You do, right? Because we got our game faces on, right? And the tragedy about our game faces and about trying to look really competent and really together is that, and most of the time we're pretty good at it. Most of the time we're pretty effective. We put out this impression that I've got it dialed in. But think about the combination of those two factors, right? I've got almost unlimited access to my own internal experience, but I've got almost no access to your internal experience, except insofar as you share it with me, except insofar as you feel safe enough to say to me, Russell, this is what it's like for me today. I don't know. All I see is your game face. All I see is this image that we all put out. So if I'm feeling all this turmoil, but then I'm looking out in the world and seeing hundreds of people that look like they have it sorted, what does that set me up? How does that set me up to experience or interpret my own experience? That stuff is something that's wrong with me. Does anyone notice this? Right? You ever have those moments in your life where you're looking around and it's like, these people don't seem to be struggling. Why am I having such a hard time? Look at them. They're struggling too. They are. They're just doing what we all do. And they're looking at you. They're looking at you, just like I'm looking at you right now going, well, they've got it all together. Natalie's not having a hard time. Why am I having such a hard time? So I think we're sort of set up to do that in a way that just is anchored to how our perception works and how it combines with our culture. We live in a culture where, and particularly those of us in the States, I travel. Before COVID, I used to travel a lot and do lots of CFT trainings all over the world. And so I was talking with Anastasia about Zurich. I got to visit Switzerland and Denmark and Iceland. I do a lot of this stuff. And before I go, I would always go online and see what should an American know before you go to another country. And you really should do that because it's very easy to make faux pas if you don't know. So for example, I was in England once and I was talking with a friend, and we were a group of friends, and my friend was there. And his wife is just a really lovely, delightful, very funny person. And so I commented that his wife, whose name is not Karen, I don't want to, this has been videotaped, so I won't use her real name. I said, yeah, Karen, she's a real kick in the pants, right? Because in the States, kick in the pants means, kind of a funny, lively, gregarious person. Not knowing that in the UK, pants is not pants, it's underwear. My friend, without missing a beat, looks at me and said, Russell, what are you saying about my wife? He, of course, texted his wife, who responded, that Russell, he's so filthy. Not true. So, since that time, I look up, right? I look up to see, okay, so what culturally, what should I know about this place that I'm going and the cultural mores and things like this. And I sort of disappeared down a rabbit hole doing that one night on the internet. And then I got curious and I thought, what do other countries tell their citizens when they come to the States? Right? So I started, and I read them from a bunch of different countries. And there were a lot of things, and I won't get it all in, but there's one that I saw that was consistent across like all of them. And what they said is Americans are naively, irritatingly, and ultimately endearingly optimistic. The Americans honestly believe that everything is going to work out okay. But don't talk to them about suffering. They won't go there. And it was really interesting because I'd never thought that about my culture at all. I'd never thought about that. Like, we don't talk about it. We don't, And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, yeah, actually, that's pretty accurate. I mean, if you look at our literature, there are some exceptions, but I mean, there are some countries, like if you look at Russian literature, they do suffering, right? They do suffering. There's an acknowledgement of it. But in the States, we don't. And so I think, if you're in a culture where the message is, you shouldn't really talk about your suffering, it's really easy for people to figure out that you really shouldn't suffer. Does that make sense? I just wrote a book applying compassion focus, a workbook for folks to apply compassion focused therapy to work with anger. And I put in some basically characters in the workbook that are working through the workbook with the reader, so people can kind of get a sense of how to engage in different kinds of anger or model. And this particular character reflected something I've had actually a lot of people talk to me about. That when we think of anger problems, a lot of times we think of externalized anger. We think of, people saying mean things or striking one another or something like this, behaving aggressively. But there are also lots of people who were taught, you must never show anger. You must never, in fact, you shouldn't even feel anger. If that wasn't said, they didn't feel it out. And a lot of people, so a lot of times when I see these folks, they're not the people coming in saying, I need help with my anger. Very often they're the people coming in saying, I need help with my depression. Right? They actually, and when you talk to them about anger, there's this sense that when I notice that anger comes up in me, it's immediately followed by shame and anxiety. I'm not supposed to have that. I'm not supposed to feel that. And so I think there's a lot of stuff that comes together that sets us up to, when we struggle or when difficult stuff comes up in us, instead of softening to it and going, oh, this is uncomfortable, this hurts, what would be helpful as I engage this, it sets us up to discount it. Say, well, I'm not going to, that's something that's bad about me, so I'm not going to pay any attention to that. I'm just going to sort of carry on. And what happens when we take the hurt and the anxiety and the anger and all that stuff that shows up occasionally, and we try to shunt it away and avoid it, it doesn't go away. It goes to the gym. It goes and bulks up and comes back. And so this is, you should know, I'm a university professor, which means I can literally start talking and never stop. Right? So if at any point, I'll pause in a moment, I want to introduce 3 kinds of compassion that we talk about in CFT, but then I want to open it up and see if there are any questions or comments. But so for this reason, one of the things we've seen in psychology over the last a little over 20 years is an emphasis on what's called self-compassion, right? Which isn't, and initially, by the way, when I heard the idea of self-compassion, I didn't like it, right? I'm like, compassion, I always thought of compassion as compassion for others. And then with Buddhist practice, that sort of extended compassion to all beings, right? And so but after seeing what a prominent role shame and self-attacking and self-loathing plays in problems for so many people, I actually think there's a really good place for self-compassion. And self-compassion isn't about you being special or setting yourself apart from others. It's actually just recognizing that if I'm going to have compassion for all beings, I'm one of those beings too, right? And that I can direct the same compassion to myself that I would direct toward anyone else that I cared about or that I loved or that I wanted to help, right? And that I can do that not because I'm special, not because I'm better than anybody, but because it's helpful, right? It helps me be the version of me that I want to be. So let me give you an example. I do compassion-focused therapy work. Like I started doing it with like volunteering and doing anger groups for men in prison. So, I like to make it easy the first time around, right? And so you mentioned compassion in that with that crowd, and there's a lot of eye rolls and things like this. But sometimes to sort of soften them up, I'll say, well, I want you to imagine like you got two children. Right? Let's say on one hand, you've got a child that you dearly love, right? Maybe this is your child or your sister or brother, your nephew or your neighbor, but you really love this child. And this child is learning something that's very difficult. Do we have any musicians in here? So if you play a musical instrument or anyone play tennis? Any tennis players? I mentioned tennis because tennis is really hard. It's like something that doesn't look that hard. It's really hard. But if you're a musician, playing music, getting good at an instrument is really hard, right? You've got to not be very good for a long time before you are good, right? You've got to sort of be okay with not being very good at it, right? And that's a struggle for a lot of us, like doing something that we're like observably not good at. That doesn't feel good. So imagine that this child you love is learning to play a musical instrument or learning a new sport or something that's really difficult. And I want you to imagine them having two different kinds of teachers, right? On one hand, you have a harsh, critical teacher. Now, I hope that you have never had a teacher like this, but I've heard from people who say they have, right? So I know it's not terribly uncommon. And we can even imagine how this harsh, critical teacher might engage with this child. No, not like that, stupid, like this. What's wrong with you? There you go. Now, screwing up again. I don't even know why I'm messing with you. Why am I wasting my time with you? You can't do anything right. Not like that, there you go. Come on. Right? So hopefully that didn't sound too familiar, but again, I've heard that there are teachers like this in the world. So I want you to imagine, on the second hand, the child has a compassionate teacher. Now this compassionate teacher has some qualities and characteristics about them. They're kind, right? This teacher cares not just about the task, but about the child, right? Wants the children to be okay, happy, safe. This teacher is also wise. This teacher understands the nature of learning difficult things and understands that if you want to help someone accomplish something difficult, what you really need to do is help them keep struggling, right? Keep going for a really long time. If you haven't noticed, by the way, this is part of the brilliance of Buddhism. Buddhism, at the very beginning, gives a series of teachings, and just even the nature of the Sangha itself, that is designed to help us keep going on the path when it gets really difficult, right? Meditations on the preciousness of having a human life, for example, right? Because there's a recognition that if we're going to work toward enlightenment, that's a long road, and it's not an easy one, right? So this teacher is wise in that way, understands that all I really need to do is keep this child struggling, and they will get better. And the teacher's confident. They know that if they actually succeed in helping the child keep going and keep struggling, that the child will get better, right? So kind, wise, confident. We can imagine how this compassionate teacher might interact with the child in an entirely different way than the critical teacher, right? Oh, there you go, that's it, keep it. Now, not quite like that, more like, oh, that's it, good job. Let's keep going. I know it's hard, but you're doing great. Keep at it. Keep at it. There you go. Well done. I'm proud of you. All right? So hopefully you've had lots of teachers like that. So I'm going to ask you a couple stupid questions and maybe not one not so stupid question. Just by a show of fingers, 1 for the critical teacher, 2 for the compassionate teacher. Which teacher would you prefer this child that you love to have? Okay. Lots of 2s, right? About the only time I ever get a 1 is if I'm working with military veterans. Occasionally a veteran will say, teacher 1, that was the person that kept me alive in Baghdad. So I'm going to change the vignette just a little bit. I want you to imagine that actually this child isn't a child that you particularly care for. I mean, except as you care for the well-being of all children. Does that make sense? But you don't have any sort of special relationship to this child. They're not your child or your nephew or your neighbor or anybody like this. They're a kid that you don't really know who's learning a difficult task. But let's say that you are actually quite invested in the child learning the task, right? You need a second chair flute in your orchestra or whatever, right? So for whatever reason, you're invested in the child succeeding at the task, even though you don't, have any unique investment in the well-being of the child. Given that, which teacher would you rather the child have? Okay, so once again, I'm seeing lots of 2s. That's good. If you're holding up 1s, I might say, well, you might be in the wrong place this week. This could be hard. So twice you've told me that you think the compassionate teacher would be better for the child. First, when your motivation was the well-being of the child, and second, when your motivation was the success of the task, right? So I guess my third question is, when you observe yourself struggling, you knew it was coming, didn't you? When you observe yourself struggling, which teacher does the voice in your head most sound like? Yeah, we got nice. We got it too. Lots of 1s. So this is the point where I just go. Just going to leave that there, right, for you to spend some time with. Now, what's interesting is if we get curious. Like, yeah, I think curiosity is a superpower. If we get curious about where that critical teacher in our head came from, like how did you learn that? Like, I want you to imagine when you were like 3 and you just learned to run and you are running. You're exploring the world. And you fell down. Do you think there was a critical voice in your head saying, wait, stupid, you fell down. Can't you do anything right? No. What about when you were like 8 and you're out playing with your friends? Did it come from there? Did you? What's the voice? Maybe a little bit then. Yeah. What about when you're 12 and you're becoming a lot more aware of your body and how other people see you? Right? Do you see how at some point, right, we learn to do something different? And maybe that critical voice, maybe, if we get curious about how did I learn that? Where did that come from? Some of you can go, I know right where that came from. That came from that person in my life who modeled that. And our brains actually are, again, adaptation machines. And if you're going to keep a human being alive, right, during a human history that's filled with lots of danger and physical threat and things like this, the one thing our brains needed to learn how to do and evolved to do very effectively is to learn about threats. Right? When information comes in that's dangerous, it's seared into our minds. Right? When we're safe, learning is much less efficient. It takes a lot more study when we're feeling comfortable and safe. But when we're in danger, our brains go shoo. And if any of you know anything about post-traumatic stress disorder, I mean, we see that in people who are traumatized, right? They have this memory that resists integration, right? It's hard to weave into the fabric of a life, but the sensory emotional pieces are just frozen. Like the person can say, I can hear the song that was on the radio before the other car hit me, So our brains, when we get these sort of painful interactions, when we have people criticizing us in ways that feel really humiliating, when we have these experiences, and I think they can happen not just through interactions with other people, but through media, these experiences that say, you're not how you should be, you're not okay, you're not good enough. Our brains, that activates those parts of our brains that are designed to respond to threat and to learn about them. And so those networks of cells in our brains become strengthened. Right? The more they're activated, the more they get strengthened. So 10 years later, we're trucking along through life. We see ourselves struggling. And that voice chimes in. You suck. You can't do anything right. Why are you so stupid? And we don't recognize that voice is not real, that no one's there. We don't recognize that voice is a neurological echo of previous experience that we've had. It's empty. It's not real. Yeah, it feels real. So some of the guys I worked with in the prison came up with a really neat way of working with that voice. It feels real, and that's actually not the worst part. The worst part is that it doesn't go away. And the reason it doesn't go away is that, again, everything we say or think or experience or do, everything that happens to us is reflected in patterns of activation of the in the brain. Does that make sense? So if I say orange, right, there's a pattern of cells that lights up in your brain. And how many of you, when I said that, thought of the color? Okay. How many thought of the fruit? Yeah? So your brain has learned to associate those syllables that sound orange with a color, with a fruit, maybe with particular emotional experiences. Maybe some of you want orange. I like oranges. I quite like oranges. When I think of oranges, it makes me think I wouldn't mind having an orange right now, right? Maybe you even have some positive emotion that comes in that's rooted in your history. Maybe, for example, you walked through an orange grove with a beloved grandparent as a child. And so there's a little of that comes up. But the whole idea is that everything we do or say or think is expressed in a pattern of activation, cells lighting up in the brain. And every time we light up that pattern of cells, the cells themselves and the connections between them are strengthened. They're insulated. The pattern is strengthened. And what that means is that over time, if we have this similar experience over and over, or if we think the same thing over and over, or if we do the same thing over and over, or those patterns get activated. They become so strong that they can fire automatically, right? So when I said orange, you didn't have to stop and think, now what is that again? You know. You just know because that pattern has been so well worn in. You feel that you know. There are other things that we feel like we know. Right? I mentioned one of them earlier. And that pattern of strengthening those patterns of cells in the brain, that happens much more efficiently when we're under threat. Our brain's working harder to store that information. So the point is that if we've had those experiences, if we've been hurt or traumatized or betrayed or even seen, experiences that didn't directly impact us, those patterns can be very well worn in. And when they light up, it can just feel like something we know. I can't do anything right. Nobody likes me. Whatever. The guys I worked with in the prison, and we can't get rid of it. The pattern will weaken over time, but only if we don't strengthen it with our minds. Right? That's why, for example, mindfulness can be very useful, because when Mindfulness really is about awareness, right? It's about being able to be aware of what's going on outside, what's going on within, when emotions arise, when thoughts arise. And so if we can notice that thought as it sort of shows up in our minds, oh, look, I just had the thought. I saw myself struggling and I just had the thought, I'm stupid, I can't do anything right. Wow. Is that helpful? Do I want to spend more time with that thought, or do I want to kind of notice it and go, thanks, Grandpa, and let it go? That's not true. My grandfather was wonderful. I'm very fortunate, but I know a lot of people who can't necessarily say the same thing. The good news, by the way, about the way our brains work is that it's predictable. So if we have new networks that we want to create and strengthen, all we have to do is practice. We can be assured, and this is, again, you've got these prayer books in front of you, you're going to be coming into contact with lots of practices here. We can be assured that when we choose to think and behave in certain ways, we are shaping our brains. We're training our brains. We're strengthening patterns that will help shape the people we'll be in the future. If we practice compassion, we cannot help but be changed by it. And this isn't like metaphysical mumbo jumbo. I'm a scientist. I have no patience for that. This is rooted in the way our brains work, right? When we connect with certain ways of thinking and certain motivations and certain modes of action, and we do those and we practice them, we're lighting up, strengthening the connections in our brains. They're going to shape how we're going to be. Right? So we can be confident when we do that. That's why Venerable Chodron and I wrote An Open-Hearted Life. Right? That's a book that we wrote a number of years ago together. And it's just a bunch of different readings and practices designed to help people weave compassion into the day in a bunch of little bitty ways, right? Just to weave it into your day, because the more we do that, the more we build and strengthen those patterns. So I'm aware, let's see, gosh, I've been talking for like an hour. So I'm going to talk for like 3 or 4 more minutes, and then I want to open it up for questions and comments. So I've talked a little bit about compassion for others, right? That's our ability to notice suffering in others and to respond to it. The second sort of what we call in compassion-focused therapy flow of compassion is self-compassion. Our ability to notice when we're struggling and suffering and go, oh, wow, look what I'm experiencing here. This is hard. I wonder what would help with that. And the third, actually, is our ability to accept and benefit and receive compassion from others when it's offered. Right? Can we let others help us when we need it? Have you ever heard people say things like, you can't love anybody else until you love yourself? Yeah, I've heard that a lot too. And I've even heard people say, you can't have compassion for anybody else until you have compassion for yourself. I think that's a load of bull. I think it's a load. I'm aware that I'm being videotaped. I think it's bogus. It's not true. It's not true. And the reason is I know literally hundreds of people all over the world, therapists all over the world, who have almost boundless compassion for others. But when they're struggling, they just have a real hard time. Either relating compassionately to themselves or asking for help and accepting it without feeling a burden, right? So instead of having, this sort of circles back to something I said to Phelan very early on, instead of having rules around how compassion should work for us, what if we just sort of got really curious about sort of how it does, like to notice, where does your compassion flow most easily? Where does it feel really natural? And where are the growth edges or the areas where you tend to struggle or where you have a hard time? So I will say, for example, that I experience myself as having a lot of compassion for others. I think that's probably why I went into psychology as a field. Became a therapist because I wanted to do that. I think it's what led me to Buddhist practice as well. I'll say after researching and teaching and practicing a lot of this stuff over the last 15, 20 years. I'm getting pretty good at self-compassion too. I still get on myself sometimes, but usually pretty quickly I'll notice, oh, right, I'm really struggling here. What would be helpful? I still struggle asking for help when I need it. I still struggle like not feeling like a burden to others. So that's my growth edge. Actually, it's the other to self flow that is where I'm at. So I want to open it to questions too, but I also in particular want to put out to you, do you notice, for example, are there some flows that come pretty naturally to you and others that are harder? And if you want to, what do you think?
I thought one thing that was really interesting is I never realized when my therapist uses compassion-based compassion, or the kind of therapy that you use, but I didn't even know she did that until you started talking about kind of how it's used in psychotherapy. Because she, throughout my life, there was a lot of like mentors who were really harsh and being like, you need to get it done. But then when I would meet with her, she'd be like, no, you're okay. And I would start saying that, but she'd be like, okay, like why are you being so mean to yourself? Like really, like I don't understand. Like you're an amazing person, just really using love towards me. And it's just it's interesting to realize that even maybe I don't even know if she realized that she's using that type of therapy too, but maybe it's just
how did that feel when she would do that?
It felt weird.
Yeah.
But now like I'm able to do that to myself.
Yeah.
And I can, use another, like I imagine like the white Tara saying something like that to me, like someone being like, oh, it's okay, like comforting voice. Yeah. But it is really impactful.
Yeah. That one thing I'd encourage you to notice too, when you've got that internal voice, whether it's a critical or a compassionate internal voice, pay attention to the tone of voice. Right? So if you're imagining white Tara whispering or saying compassionate things to you, imagine her saying them with a warm, compassionate tone of voice, and notice the impact. The reason I mention that is that a lot of people who struggle with depression, classic methods to treat depression would be, okay, we're going to identify the unhelpful thoughts you've got, because most of the time when we're depressed, we think bad things about ourselves, about the world and the future. And it's usually, I suck, the world sucks, and the future sucks, right? Nothing's good. And we tend to, and we'll tend to have specific types of thoughts too. So some people will think nobody likes me. Some people think I don't deserve love. Some people think I can't do anything right? And so classic cognitive behavior therapy would help people identify those unhelpful thoughts and then gather evidence to either support or refute them. We've since, by the way, learned that this is not the way to work with those things. And the reason is, when we gather evidence to support or refute it, we're treating the thought as something real, right? We're teaching our brains this is a real threat. It's a real thing. Whereas if we just go, oh, look, there's that critical thought again. Okay, I'm going to let you go. I'm not going to spend much more time with you. We're not reinforcing it so much in our brains. But what you would see, which is one of the factors that led to the development of compassion-focused therapy, is that some people were able to successfully do that. They said, yeah, I told myself that I couldn't do anything right, and then I went and I kept track of all my activities for the weeks, and I rated them for how well I did, and I discovered that actually I can do some things quite right, And so the therapist would have them refute the original thought with a new thought. Well, actually, there are some things I can do well. But when you would ask that person, you'd say, well, how do you feel? Well, I don't feel any better. Right? I know that there are things, but when you would ask them, how does that reassuring voice, when you catch yourself thinking, I can't do anything right, what does the voice that corrects yourself sound like? And it's like, well, of course you can do things right. Right? So is that reassuring? So I think, we want to attend to how we relate to ourselves, but also to how we talk to ourselves, but also the tone of voice, right? And I'm glad your therapist sort of helped you build that kind of new habit.
Yeah, she's an amazing woman.
Very cool. Very cool. Others, when we talked about those 3 flows, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say, I did say, what voice is inside, and I put a 1 up, but I think when I really reflect on it, I feel like the 1 is still like an echo. Like, I feel like I've been really doing the work to make it more of a 2. I realized this morning I was thinking something and I had this angry thought, And it was just like, I looked at it, instead of like getting more at it myself or thinking, well, that was a stupid thought, I just started laughing, because it was just like having that sense of humor of like, well, how silly, that's just so peculiar that would be a thought. There'd be anger there, or there goes the anger yet again, just thinking about this, and instead of being, wrathful about the anger, being like, I can't think that way, it was almost like, well, there it is, of course it's there. I mean, there, it arose because, I'm still practicing, still growing.
Yeah, and probably what'll happen is the more we develop the voice of the compassionate self, right? And we kind of think from that perspective. We think, okay, if I was that kind, wise, confident version of me, what would that version of me have to say about this situation? Right, if I was kind and wise and confident, what would I think? What would I pay attention to? Right, what would I care about? What would that version of me say in the face of this difficulty? The more we strengthen those networks and that way of being, the more that critical voice will sort of get quieter or disappear. But just when it feels like we've got it all sorted, we'll encounter another situation in which we struggle that tickles that old network in a way we didn't anticipate, and there it is again. Blah, 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 blah. Have you had that experience? Right? You do well, you do well, you do well, and then something happens. It's like, oh, here I am. And actually, when that happens, the temptation, like the version of you that thinks you should really have it all sorted already, can use that as a way to feel bad about yourself, or a way to get back into that self-critical habit. But I think, I love the Buddhist perspective on this, that taking adversity as the path. That's actually the universe teaching you, here's the growth edge, right? You've got all that sorted, but there's this bit over here that still needs to be attended to. So in some ways, it's a real gift, right? When we see ourselves slipping back, it's like, oh, okay, here's where my work lies, right? There's where I want to go. The guys I work with in the prison came up with a strategy when that voice would show up. It was really interesting. We were sitting around talking one day, and we were talking about that critical voices and things. And one of the guys said, have you ever had an idiot friend? I'm like, this sounds pretty interesting. Go ahead, tell us about this. He says, well, like someone, maybe your cousin or someone you grew up next to, and you kind of like them, mostly because you've known them your whole life and they've always been there, and but they're an idiot, right? In that sense that, like, when they say, hey, let's go do this, if you think it through, you're going to end up in prison, right? Hey, let's do this. Let's strip naked and run across the Canadian border, whatever. So he said, so it's what if that self-critic is like the idiot friend, right? And if you have an idiot friend, you don't kick them out, right? They've always been there, and you kind of like them. They're kind of fun. But when they start saying, hey, let's go do this, you just don't pay too much attention to it, right? And you go, hey, let's go, da-da-da. Or we could get a cup of coffee. Right? So what if you're self-critic? What if you just treated it like that's your idiot friend? And it's not, you don't even have to say idiot, because that's sort of derogatory. But that's your friend that heard those things or figured those things out very predictably from your life experience. Learn to be critical, learn to be harsh, and learn that stuff. And so we can understand where those voices, where that message comes from, without buying into it, right? Without taking it seriously, without taking it to be true. And say, or I could consider what's helpful. Right? I could sit here and tell myself what a piece of crap I am. Or I could recognize, this is a difficult situation. Of course this would be hard for me. I wonder what would help. Right? So, other questions? Thoughts?
Something that came out in our table during discussion this morning was, when we have compassion to others, we seem to take on others' emotions. How do you address that?
Yeah. I think that with sometimes I'm going to step back to empathy for a little bit, because I've sometimes heard people talk about empathy as feeling what other people are feeling, right? Feeling with rather than feeling for. And actually, I don't think that's the best way to consider empathy. And the reason is that it sort of anchors our presumed understanding of other people's experience in what we experience, right? So, and my whole life experience is different from other people's, right? So if I use my experience as a basis for trying to understand what you're experiencing, probably I'm going to be wrong a lot. Does that make sense? So I'm a sort of the living embodiment of what we might call privilege, right? I'm a cishet white male from a middle class family, parents who valued education and made sure I had access to it, right? I'm happy with the success I've had in life, but I also am completely aware that the path was laid before me, right? And I just needed to walk down it. I was set up. So, if a woman or a person of color is telling me about their experience, and I look at them and say, "Oh, I understand," what do you think their reaction is going to be? Yeah. Oh, no, you don't, and I know you don't, and the fact that you don't know you don't is going to be a barrier between us, right? And so I think that that part of empathy and part of compassion is this willingness to actually to have humility in the face of people's experiences, and instead of really diving into our own emotional experience as like a guiding force to direct our understanding of the other person's experience, it can be helpful to actually just get really curious about understanding. Help me understand what you're experiencing. Does that make sense? And so again, I keep talking about curiosity today. I think for me, that curiosity helps keep me from losing myself in my own and the emotional experience in me that's triggered by someone else's suffering, right? Because there's this sort of recognition that the extent to which I do that can actually be an obstacle in me being effectively compassionate with them. Does that make sense? So that doesn't mean I don't care, and it doesn't mean I'm not emotionally affected. And there are some things, for example, that when they happen, I'm not when I first learn about them, I'm not immediately actually able to come in and take action in a way that's helpful. Because, I have to tell you, when things like school shootings happen, they land, as they do probably for many of us, they land really hard for me. And at that point, there's so much like horror and rage and all that stuff swirling in me that probably anything that comes out at that point is not going to be very helpful. So what I usually do in that case is I go meditate or go for a walk or sit down with my wife or someone and talk about that. So I'm working with my stuff on my side so that when I drive to Freeman High School, like I did 5 or 6 years ago after they had a school shooting, to try and help the kids begin to feel safe back in the school again, I can be there for them in a way that's anchored to what they need. Does that make sense? And so I think compassion, one of the challenges for compassion actually is that it's boundaried in the sense that we're not, I think that sometimes people like to think of compassion in sort of heroic ways, right? And I've even heard in CFT some people use the analogy, trying to get at how courageous compassion, because it requires actually us to come in contact with stuff that makes us really uncomfortable. So there's a lot of courage in compassion. There's a lot of courage in compassion, because we're facing the suffering. We're not ignoring it or turning away from it. And some people will use analogies like the firefighter running into the burning building. I actually don't care so much for analogies that make it sound heroic, because I don't think compassion is, it's not a superhero movie, right? It's not about throwing everything we've got into this one heroic attempt to save the universe or to, and if we approach it like that, we're going to burn ourselves out real quick. Does that make sense? So I think part of being effectively compassionate in a way that actually creates change in the world and makes things better is considering how do we engage with suffering in a way that's sustainable? How do we cultivate our own minds and ourselves in a way that helps us show up in a way that doesn't look heroic, but is consistent, right? And that is reliable. Because that's, in my experience, that's the compassion that makes change. It's the compassion that shows up and again and again and again and again. And I think steadfastness is important. And so I think when people think of compassion as, I'm going to take on your suffering, I think they're buying into superhero movie compassion. And I think that for those of us for whom that just sort of happens, right? Some of us grew up in households where the emotionality was such that it was unboundaried, right? So we may have seen our parents and their emotions were glomming all over us, and growing up, we felt responsible for all the stuff that we didn't have any effect over and things like that. I mean, almost every kid, when their parents get divorced, they blame themselves, right? And a lot of that, I think, has to do with trying to make the universe feel a little more controllable, right? But I think that also some of us can grow up in situations that they don't teach us the difference between your emotions and my emotions, and how do we work with those sorts of things. And so I think to recognize that actually compassion isn't about taking on someone's suffering and experiencing it all yourself. You're going to have some of that. I mean, we've got mirror neurons in the brain, right? We've got cells in the brain that when we see someone feeling emotion, we'll feel a little bit of that. And that's helpful to the extent that it's an accurate reflection. It helps us understand a little bit of what's going on for them. But I think what's more helpful is to connect with the motivation to help them and to understand and to get really curious about what's it feel like from your side, right? Rather than using my emotional experience as a guide to what your suffering is all about. What if I let you have your experience? What if I recognize that your suffering is your suffering? And I can be brokenhearted that you have to suffer in that way. And if I want to help you, maybe the best thing I can do is to listen when you tell me what it's like. And to listen with understanding and believing, validating, and considering, what's going to be most helpful, for this person. Yeah, Anastasia.
So what you described really resonated with me, and sometimes I can observe how my compassion is not really, it's very emotional as you described, not really helpful, and also it's sometimes egoistic because I can feel that I want to actually help them to get rid of the feelings I feel.
Yeah.
So, and also in the context of the teachings in Bodhicitta, I kind of really realized I need to relook at how I understand compassion and Bodhicitta, and maybe work on the wisdom aspect also. It's always coupled, and so I wonder, in your approach, compassion-based therapy, if something like that happens, how can one kind of recenter and also differentiate between compassion that is helpful and compassion that might be a little bit lacking wisdom in a sense?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. What compassion's sort of interesting and try to measure, and that's something I actually first met Venerable Chodron because I've been doing Buddhist practice for a number of years and had reflected on how transformative it had been for my life. And I started thinking, I felt like ethically, this compassion practice has been so helpful for me. I need to bring this into the therapy room. I need to find a way to bring this into my work with my patients. Now, I'm no great scientist, but I'm enough of a scientist to feel uncomfortable about just reaching into a spiritual tradition, plucking out techniques and plopping them down in a therapy room. So I started looking, and I hadn't seen much stuff on compassion out in the field in psychology. So I thought, I will create a measure of compassion, because what happens is when you've got a measure, then the researchers can study it, and then stuff starts happening. And I quickly found, and there are several measures now, and I'm an author on one of them, and it's all right. But I found that compassion is actually notoriously difficult to measure. It's not so hard to come up with like a basic definition of, right? Sensitivity to suffering combined with the motivation to alleviate and prevent it. That's pretty straightforward. It gets a lot more complicated though. And these are what your questions are getting at really skillfully. It gets more complicated when you ask, what does it look like when you're actually doing compassion, when you're actually helping in the face of suffering? And what happens is when you look at that, there are a lot of processes that start showing up that we have to kind of be good at. So, for example, empathy came up, right? Our ability to understand the experience of the being who's suffering. That's important. Sympathy, that's the motivational aspect. Sympathy is what I feel when I see you suffering that wants me to help alleviate the suffering. And the part you're getting at, it's anesthesia, okay, is one part of compassion is distress tolerance, right? By definition, if we're going to embody compassion and to relate compassionately to suffering, other suffering our own, we're going to come into contact with really painful stuff, right? We're going to come into contact with stuff that does actually create some aversiveness in us. And as you said really skillfully, sometimes that can motivate us to act not necessarily because we're really concerned about their suffering, but because I don't want to suffer anymore. I don't want to see it anymore, right? We turn the channel, right? Or at least maybe our motivation isn't what we'd like it to be. And so I think a part of effective compassion is learning to center ourselves, learning what happens when we notice ourselves experiencing distress, when we start getting overwhelmed. And I mentioned to you just an example earlier about the school shootings, right? Me having to take some time to work with that stuff on my end before I could be helpful. You know, and I think there are a lot of practices built around distress tolerance. In CFT, there's a lot of stuff we do. One of the most powerful ones, by the way, slowing down the breath. Right? Just actually, let's practice now. Now, this is different from mindful breathing, by the way. It looks similar in terms of the form, but functionally very different, and I'll explain the difference in a second. So, what I'd like to invite you to do is to gently bring your attention to the sensation of your breath. Just noticing the breath entering you, filling your body, and leaving again. And you're not trying to control the breath, just allowing the breath to take on a nice, comfortable rhythm. I sort of know it when I find it because it just feels really comfortable. I enjoy it. Kind of easing into it. If you like, you might open your awareness to your body and see if it's possible to notice if you're holding any tension, your shoulders, your jaw, or anywhere else. If you notice that you are, maybe just allowing that, seeing if it's possible to allow that part of your body to relax. And then returning your attention to the sensation of the breath. Just gently noticing what it feels like. Maybe noticing the rising and falling of your abdomen. The flow of the breath as it enters and leaves you. And see if it's possible to allow your breath to slow just a little bit. Sometimes people will count. So breathing in to a count of 5 or 6, or 4 or 5 rather. Breathing out to a count of 5 or 6. And we can do that if we find it helpful. But for other of us, that tends to engage a control agenda, a desire to get it right. And so if you notice that tends to come up in you, I'd encourage you to let the count go and just try to breathe in a way that's really comfortable and soothing. And then when you find that rhythm, to see if it's possible to let it slow just a little more. Slowing down the body, slowing down the mind. If you've been breathing a little more slowly than normal, you might just allow your breath to return to a more typical rhythm. Again, trying to just breathe in a way that's comfortable and enjoyable, soothing if you can. And when you're ready, allowing your eyes to open and reconnect. So there's a lot of scientific data that has come out over the last 2 or 3 decades that's shown that just slowing down the breath may be the single most powerful psychological technique we have for like immediate working with threat-related emotions. So the idea is to try and breathe in a way that's soothing. So you noticed I introduced the idea of counting, and you can do that if it's helpful, to slow down the breath. So breathing in, 2, 3, 4, breathing out, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The research seems to indicate that particularly the extended exhale is really helpful for sort of softening our nervous systems, softening threat, things like this. Getting different parts of our brain and body working for us. I find that actually when a lot of people, you may have even heard this in the instructions, when they start counting, it kicks in the do it right, I need to do it right part of their brain. And so if you notice that, just let the count go. Because the purpose here literally is just to slow down the breath and to find a way of breathing that's soothing, that's comfortable, that kind of softens, slows down what's going on in your body. And if you found that it was hard to do in this room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a bunch of people that you just met, try going for a walk in the woods and see if you can slow down your breath. Or go sit underneath a tree sometime by yourself. But the idea is to begin to notice, to develop a repertoire of skills you can use when you notice yourself beginning to get overwhelmed, to sort of slow things down. And what happens is, if we slow down the body, we've actually got more nerves going from the body up to the brain than we have from the brain coming down. So you're not just working with your body. Those messages travel up to, for example, your amygdala, which is an almond-shaped structure right in the middle of your head that fires off a lot of those threat emotions. So it can soften the emotion at that level, which then impacts your thoughts, things like this. So that's an example of a basic distress tolerance skill that we can learn. But I think, Anastasia, you're absolutely right. One of a critical element of compassion is learning to recognize when our emotions are getting up to the point where it compromises our ability to behave effectively. And so that's why I think having different flows of compassion can be really useful, because they can support one another. They're distinct, actually. The research shows they're not terribly correlated necessarily. They're not super close. But if I notice that I'm getting so engaged or so aroused that I'm probably not going to be engaging well with others, I can shift my focus to working with my own emotional experience, work with that, and then extend out And this is will be of no surprise to anyone who engages themselves in Buddhist practice. Because Buddhist practice is all about working with our minds first, working with our stuff first. By the way, how many of you have done mindful breathing? If you've done mindful breathing, I want to distinguish what we just did was not mindful breathing. The purpose of that was soothing. So if you're practicing that, which we'll call soothing rhythm breathing, just slowing down the breath, if you start to nod off, no problem, take a nap. That means it's working. Mindful breathing it looks the same, right? You're breathing, maybe even breathing a little more slowly than normal. But mindful breathing, mindfulness is actually a very active mental process, right? Where you're working with the attention. You're training your attention to stay where you set it and to notice when things take it away. So you're very actively alert. So, for example, if I've had a stressful day, I'll do soothing rhythm breathing, which we did in the evening. I don't do mindful breathing in the late day. Why? Because if I slow down my breath and sit quietly, I start nodding off, and that's not very good mind training. So I do my mindfulness practice in the morning when I'm alert. So, but it does, if we're going to be compassionate effectively, we need to cultivate ways. How do I take care of myself when I get so distressed so that my distress doesn't color how I respond to the world around me? Yeah.
So I noticed a habit in myself in like two specific situations. When other people are angry or when other people are super worked up, I respond to their reaction with anger, like in both situations. Like when people are mad, like I've noticed with more specific people more so than like strangers.
Mm-hmm.
Like if they're mad, I'll be like, why are they mad? Like that's so annoying to me.
Yeah.
And then when people are anxious, in certain situations, not just like general anxiety, like when it's like hits you and I'm like, whoa, like you need to calm down. I like, instead of like being compassionate, sometimes I'm able to be nice.
Mm-hmm.
But usually like I start to get really frustrated and very like short with them, especially in my job, which is not so helpful. So because both those situations, like especially at work, I can't just like walk away mid-conversation because of the type of work I do. And like at home, like I don't want to just walk away from a conversation to calm down.
Mm-hmm.
What's a method to calm myself down and like deal with my stress from like the stress that I'm experiencing in relation to them,
Mm-hmm.
like, in the moment without being like, you know.
Well, I think one thing that can be really helpful is learning to notice it when it comes up. Do you tend to be aware of it when it happens, or?
Probably like a few minutes into it.
Okay.
I like start to get the gist of what's going on.
So here's I'll give you a suggested homework assignment. So one thing I'd encourage you to do is like when you have those interactions, as soon as you're done, like make a note of it. You could use a little notebook or like if you got a notes page on your phone and just type in the day and just maybe in a brief description of what happened or, got activated. What you're doing it's called self-monitoring. What we want to do is train your brain to notice when that happens. Because the sooner you notice, ooh, I'm getting irritated at their anger, the more quickly you can work with that in a helpful way, right? And one of the things that helps us learn to notice when something happens is to make a note of it after, right? So every time, as soon as you notice that you got irritated when that happened, when someone else would express that, just write a little note, just the date and the time, and what you're doing is you're teaching your brain to notice. And then, and try to be intentional about it. Like, see if you can do a better job at noticing when it starts to happen. So that's the first part, is the noticing. And probably the most important part. Because once you notice, oh, here it is, they're anxious, I'm getting anxious, or I'm getting angry, that's popped you out of the anger just enough that you can then have a compassionate response. Okay, what would be helpful? Right? And at that point, there are a lot of things you could do. You could just slow down your breath. Even while they're talking to you, you could slow down your breath. You could remind yourself of your intention to be compassionate, right? You might even, sometimes in CFT, we'll have people like carry something in their pocket to remind them of their intention. So I first learned about CFT in England, so I carry like a British 1 pound coin because it's got a little heft to it. I'm not going to confuse it for a quarter. And if I put my hand in my pocket, it reminds me of my compassionate intent. So that would be another thing you might do. Like when you notice, oh, I'm starting to get irritated, you could even come up with a phrase that captures that you would say to yourself, like a mantra, like, how do I want them to feel, right? Or because it sounds like what you're saying is you don't want to be angry at them for having normal human reactions, right? So it's not a deficit of compassion, it's this habitual reaction you have. So first steps to increase your awareness, self-monitoring should help with that. And the second is just between now and then, while you're working on the self-monitoring, think about what are you going to do when you notice it. And maybe remind yourself your intention, say your mantra, okay, what role do I want to play in their lives, right? How do I want my presence to impact them? Or slow down my breath, or, any number of things. That should help.
Yeah, I feel like I also struggled with that. And the best thing to help me was like, when I would write and literally just like saying like, oh, money fed me on multiple times in my head. And like, sometimes, it's okay if like you're a little bit distant from what they're saying. If it's like them just screaming at you and you're like, okay, I'm just gonna, I don't need to be fully immersed in them yelling at me. I can take a step back from my mantra. It helps a lot.
Yeah, anything that's soothing. Mantra are great that way. The nice thing about Om Mani Padme Hum, you can do an entire retreat on just the different meanings of that mantra, but to connect with the reality that this stuff that's happening right now is completely ephemeral.
Yeah.
Right? It's just, it's like the wind blowing. So am I getting really, it makes complete sense that other people are going to have emotions. It makes complete sense that, given the brain I have, that I'm going to have emotions and respond to that. What do I want to be hooked into that? Or can I shift out of it just enough to go, this all makes sense. If that kind, wise, compassionate version of me were here, what would they have to say in response to this? What would they know would be helpful? How can I respond in a way that fits? But I do think that the trickiest part is noticing it soon, training yourself to notice, and the self-monitoring will help with that. I know it seems silly, but like as soon as you notice it, like you might even like while they're raging, you see yourself, just a second. The sooner after you notice, because what we want to do is we want to train our perception to notice the arising of our anger. The other thing we can do to set ourselves up for that, mindful breathing is great, right? One of the things about mindful breathing is that a lot of times, by the way, have you done mindful breathing? Would you like? We could do a little bit of that after we take a break in a minute. But with mindful breathing, what you're doing is you're setting your attention on the breath, and then when you notice that you become distracted, that a thought's taken you away, you just gently bring the thought back to the breath. Not in a critical, oh, I screwed it up again way. I love Jack Kornfield, the way he talks about this. It's like you're training a beloved puppy. Right, that's just very tricky, and you want the puppy to stay over here, and the puppy keeps wandering off, right? So every time you catch the puppy over here, you pick it up and give it a scrub and tell it you love it, and then set it down. We want to treat our minds the same way. But actually, has anyone tried mindfulness and then gave it up because you thought you just couldn't do it or weren't any good at it? Yeah, because we think that staying with the breath should be easy. One of the reasons that the breath is mindful breathing is a wonderful way of training mindfulness, actually is that it's not easy. It's kind of boring. The breath is kind of boring, right? For a while I thought, I'll do mindfulness practice with music because I love music. The problem with music is I can stick with music. I can stay with it. My mind doesn't wander, which is great from the me feeling good about my attention way, but that doesn't train me to notice. Mindful breathing is brilliant, partially because you will become distracted, because the thoughts will take you away. And every time that happens, it's an opportunity for you to notice, thinking, back to the breath. Feeling, back to the breath. Remembering, back to the breath. You're training yourself to notice movement in the mind, right? So the more we do that, the more when we're in that situation and the emotion comes up, I'm starting to get a little irritated at their anxiety. I mean, why can't they just do their job? Oh, look, that was a critical thought. What's going to be helpful for me to do here? Does that make sense? Another way to do that, to approach that, is like through your day, just a few times. I think this practice may be in the open-hearted life. You could do what's called a mindful check-in, just like pause for a moment and just sort of curiously open your awareness to what's going on in my body right now. What am I feeling in my body? What am I feeling emotionally? Right? Am I excited, interested, bored, disgusted? What's just noticing, like with curiously, not labeling or not judging, not condemning, just noticing, oh, this is what I'm feeling. And then try to notice the thoughts, the words and images going through your mind. Right? Like, he said there was going to be a break. I really needed to go to the bathroom. When is this going to happen? That's a thought, right? Right? So noticing that. So and what happens is, if you, 2 or 3 times a day, you open your awareness to your body, your feelings, your thinking, what you're doing is you're teaching your brain to do that. You're building the habit of noticing your own experience. A lot of us don't notice our feelings. We just get carried along by them. We don't notice our thoughts. Stuff just happens and the thoughts fire up and we follow them as if they were true. I think Venerable Chodron has even got a book called Don't Believe Everything You Think. Right? We've got these brains that fire off all kinds of thoughts. And if we sort of believe every thought our brain fires off, then we're going to get ourselves into lots of conundrums. But if we sort of recognize that we've got tricky brains that fire off lots of thoughts and train ourselves to try to get curious, like, oh, wow, I'm thinking this, then I can step back and go, well, is this true? Or even more important, is it helpful? There are lots of thoughts we can have that are simultaneously true and unhelpful.